Hello and welcome to our class session, our kind of informal class session that we're having virtually. I apologize again for having to do this in this kind of a way, but I feel like there are some philosophers and some time periods that we really have to cover, and I don't think we have enough time in class to do it with time we've lost, and so that's why I'm recording this. And I thought it would work a little better, and maybe I'm wrong, if I did it in a familiar setting. So I set the camera up to be around, like with one of your heads, about that level, out on a desk. Not sure if that was a good idea or not, but anyway, I'm going to go with it. So, we were talking about Immanuel Kant last time. And I ran out of time to talk about his views on ethics, moral philosophy, right and wrong. And Immanuel Kant has a rather, at least in his time, unique idea, which is that ultimately morality is based on duty, and duty alone, not based on results. So, whether or not something is a moral action has to do with whether it is done out of moral duty or not. And we'll talk about what this duty comprised of in a second. In other words, if I save a child out of a burning building and I am successful, but I did it not because I thought I was going to get a reward, or I did it because I thought that, it was maybe a child that I really liked, and so saving them would be a good result for me, maybe with my own child. Kant would say that that was an amoral action, not immoral, but amoral. Basically, in other words, he would say that that was an action that I did for other purposes having nothing to do with morality. But if I thought it was my duty to help somebody in need, and I would have done it for anyone, regardless of who they were, so I acted out of a sheer moral duty, then that is a moral action. And he had what he called the categorical imperative, which defined these moral duties. The first is that, and I'm reading directly from it, the categorical imperative, Form 1, there is, therefore, only one categorical imperative. It is act according to that maxim which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. That's a mouthful. But what Kant means is that the categorical imperative is regarding things that we can do that could be done all the time. Would be moral to all the time, could be done for everyone. Now, within this there are what he called perfect and imperfect moral duties. Remember we were talking in medieval philosophy about how perfect can mean complete. And a perfect moral duty is one that we can do all the time. If we see somebody being attacked, we should always try to help them. If we see a child drowning in shallow water where we know we can save them, we should always act. And then imperfect duties. These are meritorious duties. Imperfect makes them sound lesser. They're very important, but they're things that we can't always do. For example, in your life you will come across many very legitimate needs for money from other people. And the fact is that nobody, not even Bill Gates, has enough money to meet every legitimate need out there. No one can do it. So it's great if you can help somebody out. Again, so long as you didn't do it based on consequences, but did it out of your moral duty to help them. But Kant acknowledges that you couldn't possibly always act on it because you don't simply don't have the resources. It's not possible. Second form of the categorical imperative. Act so that you treat humanity, whether in yourself, whether in your own person or in another, always as an end, and never as a means only. In other words, never treat somebody as a means to an end. It is not okay to, for example, punish somebody to make an example of them for everybody else, with the idea being that it will keep other people from following in their footsteps, unless you also think that punishment will benefit them. Because otherwise you're just using that person for everybody else, rather than treating them as an end to themselves. Now generally, this is rather appealing, the idea that you don't use people simply because the result will be good. A lot of the times when people are used against their own interests, supposedly for the greater good, it leads to great abuse. But there are some serious problems that creep in. You have the issue, you run into for example, if you know that somebody knows where a kidnapped child is being hidden, and you've arrested the criminal, but they're not telling you where the child is, and as far as you know, the child might still be alive. This is based on a real case where the police got in trouble for this in Germany. Do you, because the person won't talk, let the child, wherever they're being hidden, starve to death or dehydrate? Or do you threaten or even torture the person in order to try to get the information out of them? Certainly not for their own benefit. So Kant would say no. A German police officer did this to a criminal, got the information. Sadly, what he found out was that they'd already murdered the child. But then he himself was prosecuted and convicted for violating the rights of the kidnapper and killer. With the idea being that some rights can never be violated even for the end. And Germany is so paranoid after the Nazi experience of the idea of violating anybody's rights that they tend to be very paranoid about this kind of thing. And when it comes to this kind of situation, here's the problem. Most people would say, if this was a person who was guilty, especially, and you had absolute proof, most people would tend to say, no, what about the rights of the child? What about the fact that you could save a child and not, and would be willing to do it? But of course, what if you had the wrong guy? There's been countless examples of people who were pressured into confessing for good sounding reasons like this, but in reality they didn't do it. They didn't even know. So you tortured somebody, then they violated, they stopped being tortured, gave you an answer, and then you wasted your time, looking at what they made up, and you end up worse off. But again, with Kant, that wouldn't be the issue. The issue for him would be the idea that you showed that people's rights could be trampled on. And so this is the key concept of Kant's ethics. The other thing that I really want to talk about is Hegel and Marx. G.W.F. Hegel, I'm not going to speak as much about him, but he's the first of a series of philosophers who basically tried to come up with a meta-narrative for history. That history is part of some grander story. And he saw history as the story of the universe becoming aware of itself, and of humanity being aware of itself. I should note that there is somebody outside looking in at me and seeing me here lecturing to an empty room, and where she's looking in, she can't see the camera from the outside. I think she's waiting for somebody to pick her up. And she was looking at me like I am completely insane. Well, maybe I am. So Hegel believed that human consciousness was a major step in the universe becoming aware of itself. And he believed we were approaching the end of history, where the universe would be aware of itself. He believed that there was essentially a conversation that guided history, that resulted in, and you look on 394 in your book, thesis and an antithesis. In other words, pairs of opposites that would be combined in a synthesis. And this would be a major coming together of terms. And the idea would be that, you know, you could have a truth or reality and its opposite, and some kind of combination in which the points are combined. And he believed that this was a major example of becoming aware of something. For example, Plato said that things endure constantly. Heraclitus said that nothing can endure. And as these would come together, they were then finally seen. Parmenides said nothing would endure. I messed up there. This is bad because I'm on video. Parmenides said everything endured permanently. Heraclitus said that everything was temporary. That was the antithesis. And Plato, with his world of the forms, it was permanent, and this world, it was not, combined them. And so that was the synthesis. He would stick a finger at Immanuel Kant by writing a book called The Phenomenology of the Spirit, suggesting that spirit was something that one could study in the realm of the phenomena, not just often the noumena that we can't really study. Now, he was kind of an egomaniac, and in his later years, he decided that we were at he took this end of history farther. He thought that the ultimate coming together of the universe was his philosophy. So basically, the whole reason that the universe came into being, and humanity came into being, and everything else, was ultimately to reach his philosophy. He had kind of a cult-like following, incidentally. But he talked about absolute ideas that ultimately guided the universe. His idealism was a major influence. But you have Karl Marx, who will take the opposite. And I'm going to have a little more to say on him in class, because he is somebody that, whether you agree with him or not, has had such an impact on our world that I think you need to be aware. But Marx lived in the mid-1800s, and this was a time when the Industrial Revolution was going on. And people, at the same time, farms were becoming mechanized and needing fewer people, so you had all this labor, not all this unskilled labor, not enough jobs, and no social safety net, no protections. China is still like this in some ways. Nowadays, if you work at a factory and you got your arm cut off, you'd be getting a big settlement. You might even file criminal charges. Back then, you would be fired because you weren't really useful without your arm. And if your bleeding everywhere destroyed the product they were making, well, you probably have to pay for that. In fact, it got so bad there was a big rise of vegetarianism in this country in the late 1800s because of the fact that meat had become so unsafe that it was from a factory. In fact, it used to be if you got your hand cut off on the meat packing thing, it was ground meat, so nobody would recognize it. They would just ship it on, and here's what Marx saw. The ordinary people were working hard and getting nothing, while the capitalist class that owned the factories were profiting. They were enriching themselves. They were getting all the fruit of the labor of other people. And what he believed is that the working classes ultimately had the power, because he saw the upper classes as not really doing anything. And he saw the middle class as basically just supporting the upper class, but doing nothing else. This is Marx's perspective. And he believed that ultimately the story of humanity and indeed the universe is of labor, getting laborers, people who work, getting in touch with the fact that they ultimately have the power. And once they break free of this delusion and rise up and take control, they will have a virtually perfect society where the working people rule and there is nobody who rules over them. He believed that there should be what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat, which would have a leader who would rule it. This is what we kind of see in communist countries. He actually believed that once communism was achieved, essentially government would go away, other than some administrative functions like maybe making train timetables to make sure there aren't, coordinate things, to make sure there aren't two trains going in opposite directions on the same track, coordinate resources. Beyond that, there would not be government. Of course, this has never happened, and generally people with absolute power don't give up power. He believed that the upper classes did a lot of things to fool and delude the lower classes, turning them against each other with racial and ethnic hatred, the oppression of women. Also, he believed that religion was, he called it the opiate of the masses. Of course, an opiate is a drug that makes you really calm and not really care what's going on. And what he said is, here's the way it works. Yes, you're poor. Yes, you have a miserable life. But you are the blessed of God. And therefore, your reward is in heaven. It's going to be a lot better than the people who are living well. After all, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to get into heaven. So you are going to get your reward. And if Marx was an atheist, and so he thought, these people work all their life for nothing while other people live it up, and when they die, they're both dead. And, it was a trick. And that's how he saw it. And he believed that the religious authorities basically used their religious ideas to basically keep people deluded and not focused on their present material lacking. He didn't believe there was any kind of value except material deprivation. He believed that people were alienated from their work. He believed that's what caused psychological problems, crime, conflict, was that the mental damage it did to work your whole life and other people be the one who profit from it. Many people would argue there is some truth to this. I mean, there is the issue of exploitation of workers and people not being alienated from their work. Many people think, though, he oversimplified things. His description of the problem was better than his solution. He never valued inventors, entrepreneurs, and people who manage things, which is part of the reason why communist countries often didn't manage things well or handle innovation and invention well. Another thing that he did was, one thing that affected a lot of things like the Soviet experience was his assumption that once people were equal and didn't economically and didn't have the fruit of their labor taken, that religion would just wither away. And that did not happen. People's religious faith was not simply based on that. We will talk about this. We will talk about how this has affected different societies when we get together next time. We will also talk about Soren Kierkegaard in chapter 26, and Friedrich Nietzsche we might get to in chapter 27. And so I remember to do your quizzes and your essay question, and I will go over those next time too. Again, I apologize for having to travel. Have a great day, and I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday, November 5th. Thanks.